Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for Lessons in Leadership from Banned Books. I'm Courtney James with the Office of Student Involvement, joined by today's panelists. So we are obviously here today talking about, or as part of Banned Books Week. So if you weren't aware, this week, the DePaul Library is coordinating an effort to get the word out about banned books. So we're going to start with panelist introductions. So panelists, if you can just share who you are, what you do here at DePaul. Students, please share your majors as well, and perhaps why you joined today's panel. So Savannah, we'll start with you.
Sure thing. I'm Savannah. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm studying WRD and communications here at DePaul. I joined the panel today because I love books. I love reading. Kat and I run the book club here at DePaul. And yeah, I am really passionate about banned books and just books in general and getting more people to read as many of them with as many diverse experiences as possible. So yeah.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Kat, how about you?
Hi, my name's Kat. I'm studying psychology here at DePaul. And I think I wanted to be on this panel because when I was growing up, reading was a way of learning about the world. So I think the idea of banned books just really limits the amount of perspectives people can get.
Awesome, thanks. And Sveta.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Sveta. I'm one of the librarians here at DePaul, and I'm here because the library celebrates Banned Books Week every year, but also because I'm really interested in how banned books and challenges kind of intersect also with the inability to access books that represent diverse perspectives and identities. I think if you look at any list of banned books, you'll see that we had a really good performance with City Lit Theater earlier, and 8 out of 10 books that they performed excerpts from were all books that were banned or challenged because they represent folks with LGBTQI identities. And so that intersection is something that I'm really interested in exploring, and I think it's really important to be part of our discussion of what are banned books and why are books banned.
Great. Thank you. And Marie.
Hi everyone, I'm Marie Donovan from the College of Education here at DePaul. I teach in the Department of Teacher Education, and I also direct the Early Childhood Education program, where I teach children's literature and young adult literature courses. And like Sveta, I'm here because I'm hoping that there are a lot of you watching and you'll get inspired and excited to help, especially teachers in Illinois public schools, do something that a lot of us have spent the last almost 40 years getting put into law. And that is, it's now law in Illinois that anybody teaching history in elementary school must include people who identify on the LGBTQIA communities. And with the pandemic hitting, the State Board of Education wasn't able to get the curriculum ready for teachers to start teaching this fall. And now that the curriculum's not ready and teachers are, a lot of them are teaching virtually, what's happening is the excitement about incorporating other and these multiple perspectives and who these people were in curricula is being wiped out. So I'm hoping this panel will help all of you learn more about banned books. And as Sveta said, what are the connections between and among when you can't read the literature about the people in the first place? Whose history are you learning anyway? So I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining. So I'm going to take a second and introduce myself too. So like I said, I'm Courtney from the Office of Student Involvement. I use she, her, and her pronouns. And, we're streaming live to our student involvement Facebook page, and some folks might be curious of why is student involvement doing this? And a little bit about me, but one of my majors when I was an undergrad was English, and I was telling the panelists before this, I took a children's literature class, and I was fascinated. I think at that point I learned about what banned books were, and that there were these lists that people were saying there are books that you can't talk about or you can't teach. And for me, that wasn't something I really experienced too much growing up in the school I wasn't exposed to it. At least teachers may have chosen not to share books, but it wasn't something I was exposed to. So that idea and concept that it wasn't really this free, there wasn't this opportunity for a free exchange of ideas and concepts and thought really kind of jarred me. It was really surprising. And then even to take it a step further, and I did not go to DePaul, so I'll say that as a precursor. But I remember we had a debate in one of our classes about should you be allowed to ban books. And in all honesty, the class was at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning. And I remember being a little bit tired. And one of my friends said, like, yes, we should ban books. And I've never woken up so fast in a class in my entire life, because I was floored that there's this, and I went to college a while ago, but there are people who believe we should be banning books, right? And that we shouldn't expose. And we were talking about To Kill a Mockingbird of all books, right? Like, so I'm really excited that there are other people who are just excited to really talk about banned books here as much as I am. So I'm really going to try to hold that role of facilitator, but if I stream into conversation a little bit too, that's a little bit why. But so our panelists, as we start talking here, I'm curious to hear from you all. I obviously just shared a little bit of my story about my first experience with banned books. When was the first time you were introduced to the concept of banned books?
I think I probably learned about the idea for the first time actually when I was in library school. So I went to graduate school for library information science, and since this is a American Library Association kind of event, my program always did a celebration every year. And I was actually really surprised. I've read a lot of books that are on the banned books lists, and a lot of them I even read in my high school curriculum. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, is a commonly challenged book. But it wasn't until I got to graduate school actually that I really understood this was a regular recurring phenomenon that was being tracked on a kind of annual basis.
Yeah, I think I've kind of known about them through libraries and stuff, like libraries celebrating banned books and getting people to read more of them. But I didn't really have a moment in school or anything where anybody told me about them. And it was the same for me in terms of I've definitely read banned books throughout my time that I've been in school, but none of the teachers have opened that conversation up while we've been reading those books or anything to actually discuss that and what it means. So yeah, I think I've known about them, but not really had the knowledge that I could have if, that conversation were more open.
I think I was fortunate in that in my freshman year of high school, we read The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and that's a frequently banned book. And our teacher actually had us read an article about the book being banned. And I remember in the article, they had interviewed a mother who was for banning. And she said, yeah, I was going through the book as I usually do and blacking out all the words that I didn't want my son to read. And I realized I had to black out so many words in this book. And I was like, you do what to your son's books? And I think that just really exposed me to this shocking idea of just completely restricting what children especially read, and about such important concepts and such an important perspective that is brought in the book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian.
I was 5 turning 6, and this would have been 1962 or so. And my friend Billy Nicholas, his mother was learning to be a librarian. She was in library science school. And she brought home, she always brought books home for us, and Billy and I would sit on the stoop. I grew up in New York City, we had stoops. And I just remember sitting there reading The Cat in the Hat with him. And we loved that book. And one of our neighbors, who was sort of like one of those Gladys Kravitzes, if you know Bewitched, if you know who that is. And I remember she came over and said, "What are you children doing? Reading that book of all books," and grabbed it out of our hands and marched upstairs to yell at poor Kate Nicholas. And my mother heard about it. My father heard about it because I ran home and was so upset. And my parents were, "Who is this woman telling you can't read something?" And soon after that, my parents stopped talking to her. But I thought, what could be so bad about this book? And it wasn't until I was much older when I learned that why Cat in the Hat was banned was because a lot of parents felt that it was very inappropriate to model for children the danger of allowing a stranger to walk into your house and upset it so. Even though the cat cleaned up before he left, still, that was bad modeling for youth. So that's how I learned about banned books, Cat in the Hat.
Yeah. Well, and I think that brings up, some of the titles even that you all were talking about here. And, to go kind of off of our list for a second here, I'd be curious because some of our viewers might be surprised to hear some of the titles that have shown up on banned books lists. And I pulled a couple beforehand. So for folks that are watching, if you're like, these books must be really extreme and crazy, but Marie gives the perfect example of The Cat in the Hat, right? Of this book that, I think particularly, like, I know for me, I grew up knowing, and I imagine a lot of our college students do too. But, in prep for this session, I saw a list of some of the current titles, and it's things like the Harry Potter books, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, The Catcher in the Rye. We talked about To Kill a Mockingbird already, The Giver, The Things They Carried, Fahrenheit 451. I very vividly remember my Fahrenheit 451 lesson from English high school class. So I'm sure my English teacher would be happy. The Handmaid's Tale, which obviously is really popular. But are there any other titles, that folks that come to mind for people that for our viewers, they can think a little bit and conceptualize a little bit more about what might show up on that list that anybody wants to share before we move on?
The thing about Fahrenheit 451, it's irony of irony, right? I mean, it's about book burning, and yet and lots of times it was censored as opposed to banned, and we probably should define those terms a little bit first. There are different, so banning and censoring, challenging, it's all about preventing somebody's access, right? I mean, it just goes against the fundamentals of our democracy, no? Free people read freely. That's what librarians wear, I'm sure you have the T-shirts, Sveta, right, for the American Library Association. And so the thought that, why would a book like this be required to have limited access or no access, right? Banning means nobody has access to it. And it was for the profanity, laced throughout. It was the dialogue in that book. And yet to this day, there are still communities that are not comfortable with Fahrenheit 451 of all books. I think about some of the, Draw Me a Star, an Eric Carle picture book. What could be wrong with that? Well, people don't exactly like the way, certain characters are depicted. Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Remember reading that when you were in elementary school or middle school? And oh no, it's just, there is violence, and the way the characters are depicted, they're overly realistic. Children would be scared. So it's The Chocolate War. That's another one. It's like, what's wrong with The Chocolate War? Well, they describe, that there's too much detail about nudity in there. So, there are lots of reasons why, children and adults even are, not, given limited access to these books.
Yeah, for our viewers, if you haven't had a chance, I mean, honestly, you can go on and you can Google even a banned book list. I mean, it's just fascinating. Like I remember, and we can actually get it posted here in the chat shortly for our viewers. But it's just fascinating to scroll through and go through. So going back to our questions here a little bit, Savannah and Kat, you talked a little bit. I think probably because you're the closest ones on the panel in terms of actually being in high school and obviously still as students. But I'm curious if folks can talk a little bit about if banned books were introduced to you as part of a curriculum. So did a teacher, professor provide them to you, or did you have to go and seek them out?
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, I did have now that I'm thinking back, a lot of books we read that were required readings were banned books. I mean, things like The Giver, To Kill a Mockingbird, books we've talked about. But yeah, a lot of them were required for me to read through school and were sponsored through my education, but that conversation never really came up of them being banned or why they were banned, or, it was just more about the context of the books and needing to read them, which I think is interesting because I feel like it creates a perfect opportunity to create that conversation, especially when books like that, like To Kill a Mockingbird, especially you can relate that back to other people's experiences and other people's lives and history. And I think that's a perfect opportunity to bring up banned books and the reason why, you know, people try to shelter certain information from people or, you know, even from kids. Yeah, I wish it was discussed a little bit more, but yeah, I've definitely read a lot through school.
Yeah, I also read a lot of the titles that you mentioned, Savannah, within school. And then like I said, I was lucky that my teacher freshman year of high school did facilitate a conversation on like, why are books banned and should they be banned, which was really great. And it was eye-opening, I think, for me, because I was always allowed to read whatever I wanted. And I was very benefited by being allowed to read whatever I wanted. So it was helpful to know like that is not the case always, and that there are places and there are voices that are trying to be silenced. So I think like it was really great to learn about that in school. And then there's other books that I definitely read outside of school. Like some I find on the list, there's some interesting books that are just like super popular books that a lot of young people read. And I think that's interesting that like very popular YA books are what's banned. And it's very much like just trying to, you know, control what young people are reading, like middle school age kids, as if they haven't already been like exposed to most of the concepts and like language in the stories.
I think that's a really, go ahead, Marie. I would say that's such an important, I think, point in that we should remember that like book bans and challenges often happen in like public libraries and school curricula. And it's often in places where young people have access to books, but like folks who like maybe don't have independent access to books, right? Don't have independent income, can't go out to the bookstore, buy whatever they want. And so limiting access to these titles in these places like the school library or the public library means that, you know, students might not have that access at all. And also, I want to kind of bring in another example of a context we might not think about when we're thinking about like youth and access to books is books are also often challenged or banned from like special facilities like juvenile incarceration facilities, for example. There's a lot of restrictions on the kinds of materials that youth that are incarcerated can read, and often kind of banned for very problematic reasons. So it's interesting that, you know, there's this really uneven access because some of the books that are frequently banned are things like The Great Gatsby or like Invisible Man, James Baldwin's novels, things that are like oftentimes at the heart of curriculum in other parts of the country. And so that imbalance is a really interesting, I think, thing to reflect on.
You know, and to your point there, Sveta, you know, Kat, I'm curious, you know, speaking of leadership, taking leadership, you know, your teacher in high school who actually created that unit on banned books for you. I'm wondering, do you have any memory of how your fellow students reacted to them? You know, what were the discussions like? And for that matter, was there any backlash for the teacher, even you know, teaching a unit like that? Because in some areas of the country, including here in Illinois, as recently as last year, there have been some schools, mostly private, not so many public. Well, there's one public downstate where teachers who introduced banned books in schools were told by their boards of ed, you know, what are you doing? Slap their hands. What do you remember?
I don't remember any backlash from the school or anything, but I do remember, like, in terms of my fellow students, I think we were all pretty indignant about the idea of banned books and thought that it was, you know, preposterous that, you know, adults would try and restrict what we would have access to. But I think that's kind of all I remember. I don't remember in terms of like the larger context. I probably wasn't as aware at the time of what the teacher was doing, you know, in the context of the school and like the state at large.
Yeah, so in that same regard of like, you know, going into your memory banks, and we heard about Marie and the Cat in the Hat, obviously. I'm curious if, you know, folks would be comfortable sharing what's one of the very first banned books you remember reading and why was it so significant? I imagine, Cat, it's probably that book that you, obviously you talked about in that memory in high school, but, you know, yeah, just curious to hear more.
Right, yeah, I remember that book a lot, actually, like not all of it, it's been a while, but I remember like really, it was very informative about a lot of things that I didn't know about. And I think that was, again, like this point's been said, but like a lot of times the banned books are the very like voices and stories that aren't told very often. I can't think of any other time that I've read in school like a story centering on someone who's Native American. And so this one was, and it was just such an informative and like good book, full of like nuanced like critiques of just society and everything. And so the fact that that was, you know, the first banned book I read, when it was the book that probably is one of the most, you know, specific perspectives that I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. It's just really interesting to see how that, you know, that's usually related, looking at the whole list of banned books, that you see a lot of stories that are some of the most important stories that we should be hearing right now, that instead are banned.
Yeah, I think if I looked back, like way back, I could probably think of another first book. But thinking about probably the first book that I recognized as a banned book was The Giver, which I mentioned earlier. But I read The Giver when I was in middle school, like early middle school, I think, probably 6th or 7th grade. And that was, I think, the first book that I really knew was a banned book, and also like was a bigger book that had like actually like not like Cat in the Hat, you know, not that that discredits Cat in the Hat or anything, but yeah, I think that was the first book I actually like knew was a banned book. And yeah, I think The Giver sticks with me too, because it's I don't know, it just is so interesting. And I think even in the context of thinking about banned books, you know, the whole idea in The Giver of like, you know, sharing ideas and thoughts and creating the society where those aren't shared, and it's so private and hard to access, like kind of like we were talking about with Fahrenheit. It's just so counterintuitive to ban that concept and that idea, because it's exactly the thing it's fighting against. So yeah, I think it's interesting.
But so often why The Giver has been censored and challenged, not necessarily banned, is because people in those communities, parents in those communities and the other adults, were arguing that this is such, you know, this society that you want children to read about is so against American core democratic principles that this is a bad thing for children to be exposed to.
Right. Right. It's crazy.
Yeah.
One of the first banned books that I remember like really loving was Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, which I probably read when I was like in 8th or 9th grade or something, and it was the first time I really thought about like war and the impact of war. And I think one of the reasons it's been challenged is it's like called like anti-American, to like criticize you know, something that we should be really, really thoughtful about and have, I think, a very critical perspective. And when I learned that was a book that kind of was like frequently banned and challenged, that like clicked together for me in a way. Because I remember reading that book and like really asking questions that I hadn't asked before. And I think that's something that people are afraid of. Like that's a fear and emotion that maybe motivates a lot of these challenges, is that maybe now these young people or these other folks are going to start asking questions that they wouldn't have asked before. And we live in a democratic society, so we should not be afraid to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't be afraid to ask questions and explore that. I mean, I think now more than ever, you know, and it is important for us to explore the perspectives of other people, you know, and like, and I think that knowing also that this is a panel put on by folks at DePaul, I think that's one of the things that's great about DePaul and about you know, who we are as an institution. Like we can bring folks like this together to have this free exchange of ideas, because, you know, to me, I always think about the Father Egan statue that I walk past when I walk into the student center that says, "What are you doing for justice today?" Well, one of the ways that you explore what are you doing for justice is by critically thinking about issues, and you get better about thinking about issues when you learn about different perspectives, and books just do so much to teach us that. And the characters in these books are really, really critical to help tell that narrative. So I'm curious for our panelists, either from, some of the books that we've talked about here or others that, we've mentioned or others that about, has there been a time where you've particularly related to a character in a book? And what was it about that story that really resonated with you? I know for me personally, while folks are thinking, I will forever and for always be amazed that the Harry Potter books show up on banned books lists. I mean, especially when I think about when they came out. I actually, not as an educator, I worked at a school, at an elementary school, as a janitor. Which, if my mom oftentimes tunes into the stream, so she'll be happy to hear my shout out to my old summer job. But I would see kids walking around and reading like the Harry Potter books, and not only reading them, but like fully digesting and understanding them. And I was reading them too. And I remember learning about like Hermione Granger and how much I didn't know how to pronounce her name at the time. I was in the camp that thought it was Hermione, personally, but I remember like reading about her and her like inquisitorial spirit, and like how she just generally like aimed for success in all that she was doing. Right. And I have a very, very vivid imagination. And I remember like there were times that I would like, when I was younger too, I'd like think about like, okay, like if I was in, this potions class, or I was like in that classroom, and, J.K. Rowling, whatever you might say about recent issue, like when I read the book, I remember thinking about that and like painting this really, really vivid picture and seeing, parts of myself and like what I would do in like the classroom in this like fantasy world. So I know that was one time that I oftentimes saw it.
Yeah,
Courtney, as you were talking, go ahead, Savannah.
Okay, I was just going to say, kind of going off this, that's not really, this is really kind of a non-answer, but I think that's so important too, because like when you're talking about especially diverse books that are getting banned, right? Books that are about people in the LGBTQIA plus community and people of, different backgrounds, and those stories not being able to be told. Books are being consumed by a diverse audience. Like, they're not supposed to be tailored towards one type of person. And like to keep those stories from being read by the people who need to read them, to have characters that look like them or sound like them or, act like them in any way, like you're taking away, this projection of their identities and their, someone that they can relate to, even if that is just in a fictional setting. And I think it's so important to have such diverse stories because, even if people think kids can't relate to them, a lot of times they can. They come from those backgrounds or their stories. And I just don't think it's necessarily fair to limit them from being able to see themselves in any media, but especially in books. So.
In children's literature circles, we refer to that as mirror books and window books. And mirror books are books that reflect, children can see themselves, as you're saying, Savannah. And then, of course, the window books are books that are not anything like, either in character or theme or setting, anything like the children, right? Same thing for adults, I would argue, too. And I always add a third piece to this, though. I always say, I want mirror books and I want window books in my collection, but I also want springboard books, books that are meaty enough that we can dig in and really start talking through. And I'm curious, especially for you, Kat and Savannah, books like The Hate You Give or 13 Reasons Why. That's a big one that became so controversial so fast among school psychologists especially. And I'm curious, when you think about windows and mirrors and springboards, and then how 13 Reasons Why has been, censored and banned in a lot of public libraries in small towns and larger towns. They've tried it too, as well as in school libraries. So I'm curious, hope you don't mind, Courtney, if I,
Go for
take
it.
us off in a bit of a slightly different direction here. So I'm curious, what do you think of that as young adult readers? Should something like, 13 Reasons Why be banned or censored?
I think that's like an interesting example too, because I have my own like critiques of 13 Reasons Why, right? But I think this comes from this panic that, the book deals with, for example, like mental health issues. And I think the idea that you're going to solve the problem by banning the book instead of actually, addressing the mental health problems that it brings up, is this kind of like totally going in the wrong direction, and I think it's just like a panic response and not actually knowing and not actually thinking thoughtfully about like how to engage, the problem and how to like engage people. Like now you have people talking about the issues that the book brings up. Now you have like a starting off point for a conversation that you can hold in schools or in classes instead of just shutting that conversation down because you're scared of what, people might say or think.
Yeah, I was going to say a very similar thing, just kind of going off of that. I was just going to say that, yeah, a lot of times the conversation comes back to the book. Like the book does this and the book does that, but the conversation doesn't come back to the actual topic of the book. And I think, like, definitely agreeing with what Kat said, I think those books, whether you personally agree with them or not, can help open conversations and can help, springboard those conversations, like you were saying. And just because someone doesn't personally agree with them or think it's, the best, conversation in the book or think the book shouldn't be read by certain, ages, I don't think that necessarily means that you should block people from having access to something that can lead them to that conversation. Even if it's a conversation critiquing the book or the way the book is handling something, that still opens conversation, so.
Well, and I think that this is a really fascinating conversation because, and Kat, this really, I really started thinking about this when you were talking, because I think part of, and I feel like well, stay with me here for a second. When people read books, and I love, Marie, what you talk about with like the mirror, or like the concept you introduce about like the mirror books and window books and springboard. But if people read a book and they read a book that, potentially has these challenging topics and it is a mirror book, I think the other thing that it then amplifies is if a student reads it, the issues were there before, right? Like they were dealing with mental health, or they were with mental health issues, or they were dealing with some sort of crisis. So if the mirror book, if you read a title like 13 Reasons Why and you find it to be a mirror book, then it brings up this really problematic component that if a school or entity is deciding not to read it, it's because you don't have the infrastructure that will allow you to support those students who now suddenly see themselves in this new experience, right? And like now this to me is really tying into like a lot of modern day conversations on top of this, right? In terms of like, we know in the city of Chicago there is a huge conversation going on right now about the role of counselors versus police officers in schools, right? So now suddenly this curriculum is tied to this really important social issue. And like it starts as a microcosm. It might start as this one thing that, somebody put on a list, but now it's going into the classroom, which is part of that school, which affects how that school affects us in Chicago, right? So like it's this huge pipeline that like this singular decision of someone deciding not to put it there and not giving students that opportunity, or young people anyone that opportunity to see themselves, it just amplifies for me the lack of infrastructure that might exist and support, particularly, and I think because we're talking about 13 Reasons Why, the challenges that come along with that.
I think it's such a good question, I think, because it does kind of force us to like reflect and like think about this is, cut and dry, like books should be made available and accessible. However, like it's, sometimes there are books that we don't agree with, and like, what are the ways, and maybe they're not the books that we necessarily need to put on the curriculum, but what are the ways that we can like still have them available and opening up conversations? And also, like, how can we remember that like many things in our society, book bans and challenges are like not equitably distributed. And a book is so much more likely to be banned because it has, it portrays characters of color, or is critical of our society, or has LGBTQI content that is like inappropriate for young children according to somebody's subjective perception. And I think there are sometimes books that are banned because they're offensive. And that does really put us in a position where we have to like think kind of critically in a nuanced position of like, okay, well, how do we deal with things like this? Maybe we don't put them at the heart of the curriculum, perhaps, but is like a ban or a challenge the right answer? And it's not always as cut and dry. And I think that's what I really appreciate about this topic, is that it does kind of push us to think a little bit about our values and how we ask each other questions, like how we turn these things into springboards, if that makes sense. And to always for me, it always comes back to the fact that like it's not an equally distributed kind of phenomenon.
I was just going to say on top of that, like, I think a lot of newer authors are kind of touching on it a little bit more, but in terms of making books more accessible too and addressing some of those issues, I think universally having content warnings for books is something that like exists, but isn't super, in my opinion, at least from my experiences, I should say, isn't super easily accessible. I mean, you can ask people about books and you can get that word of mouth, but it's not like printed on the books, or it's not, you have to look for it. And I think content warnings are important so that people know what they're reading. And I think it helps with some of those issues in that, like, again, things can just be offensive and can just be something that personally doesn't sit well with somebody, but it lets them make that choice, and it doesn't keep other people from not being able to read it if that's not something that bothers them, or if it's not something they agree with. So yeah, I think that's something that authors and publishers and things are working towards, but it would be exciting to see it more accessible, just because I think it would definitely help in that area.
Yeah, so I think that this conversation gets me also thinking about, obviously, or turning a little bit to, I guess how banned books, or how titles, or how characters, or how things like how we approach literature might influence our leadership style, right? And particularly, calling back to the title of our session, which is right above me here, right? I'd be curious if there are, and I wouldn't just limit it to, philosophy or characters or stories, but are there philosophies that you've learned from, your reflection on banned books, or on this experience that perhaps have influenced you in leadership scenarios, or in different situations that, you wouldn't have otherwise thought about? I know, for me, I've had the opportunity to, I think that for me, the concept of banned books, and I still go back to that debate I had way back when I was in college, like it set a foundation for me about this free exchange of ideas that I really appreciate. And I think, as a staff professional at DePaul that advises a lot of student organizations, I think I have colleagues, not only, at DePaul, around the country, who oftentimes will lean away from potentially controversial topics. But I think that foundation of having this understanding about banned books for me has really allowed me to lean into those conversations a little bit more in my everyday life. So just curious, for a panelist, if anyone has any, and I know it's a little bit of a jumbled question as I'm asking it here, but I hope you understand the heart of where I'm going with it.
I think like learning about banned books, I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but it has definitely influenced. I work with kids a lot over the summer as a camp counselor, and learning about banned books and kind of like, I just critiquing the idea of, shutting down conversations, shutting down controversial things. I think that affects, sometimes when little kids bring up topics, there is this like panic response of like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know how to like deal with that. But instead of, trying to be like, let's not talk about that right now, but to like relax and be like, okay, no, this is a conversation. Like if they're having the conversation, then it's a conversation like that they can have right now. And like trying to facilitate that conversation instead of just, kind of having that response to immediately shut it down. And I think that's something I've definitely learned from discussions around banned books, and the importance of, actually working through issues instead of just shutting them down immediately.
And that, Kat, I think that working through issues, particularly in today's society, cannot be, let's say that 100 times, right? Like having this framework for exploration and, thinking about perspectives of others and working through things, we need that today more than ever before. So thanks for sharing that.
But I think too, whatever kind of leadership role you're in, as a reader, the people you work with, leadership is all about caring for the people who have said, we want you to lead us in this way, whatever capacity, you're leading in. And so I can't think of, there are lots of ways you can show people you care about them, but especially in a professional arena, to me, sharing books with them that are mirror or window or springboard books, to your point, Courtney, is such a powerful way of showing how much you care. Because when you put that book into somebody else's hands or send them the URL, and say, read this and let's talk about it, that person knows, hey, you were thinking of me and something I'm dealing with as you read that. And now you're showing me this by bringing me in there too. And I can't think of a more powerful way to show you care.
I think, such an important aspect of leadership, whether it's like formal or informal or like among our peers, is empathy. And I'm such a firm believer that like reading builds empathy and allows you to relate to stories that are your own, not your own, kind of lean into the nuance. And I think there is not a good leader out there that does not exhibit empathy. So
That's a great point. Well, and I think, as we grow and develop, we take pieces from all of these different places, right? Like we learn as we go. We as humans are a compilation of all of these parts around us. So we're a compilation of mentors and friends and things we read, things we see, like, and I would be the person, I have yet to find this shirt, but I will be the one who wears the t-shirt that says the book was better than the movie. You can't watch a movie and experience the same thing that you get from reading a book. It's just not compared, like even The Cat in the Hat, like The Cat in the Hat, 2.5 hour movie, the book, I'd still say the book was better, right? Like and I just think it's so, just generally it is so important for people to be lifelong readers, because you will be forever exposed to ideas and concepts that you wouldn't otherwise know. But for our viewers, if you have any questions or topics you'd like for our panelists to discuss, feel free to post them in the comments. We could ask them live on screen here. But we're heading towards the tail end of our interview, which I can't believe how fast our time has gone here. But in the spirit of this being Banned Books Week, just want to hear from panelists about, and I know we've talked about it a little bit, but if you have any final wrap-up thoughts or closing thoughts about why it's important to read books that show up on the banned books list.
For me, it's like voting. I vote to make a statement in my world here, in our democracy. And to me, the fact that I can still go and find a banned book and read it is also making a statement about what it means to live in a democracy.
I definitely agree with that comment. It does make a statement. And I think also it just like, what is the word I'm looking for? I was just going to say like it opens you up to so many different viewpoints and different worlds and different experiences, and it lets you see yourself in the same time, or it lets you, see somebody on paper and lets you really bond with them in that way. And I just think it's so important to be able to have those experiences and to learn about other people's experiences. And I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, empathy and leadership, I don't think you can lead, or I don't think you can be as empathetic if you don't learn about those experiences, if you don't learn about other people. So yeah, I just think overall there's so many stories, and if we keep any of them from anyone at any given point, what are we missing out on by not telling those stories? So.
I think also reading banned books and also just being aware of what books are being banned right now and for what reasons really lets us know kind of what's going on in society as well. Like what are people afraid of right now and why are they afraid? And then also like whose voices are being silenced, and in response to that, like whose voices should we then deliberately like uplift and include in our curriculums and in our reading lists. So I think it gives you a kind of a window into society as a whole.
I think that's such a great response. I mean, in some ways, I feel like we've been discussing this question for the full hour of, what we get out of this. But I don't really know that there's anything else that I would add beyond. I mean, I think you'd be surprised, like the books that end up being banned, right? And I think it really does ask us to reflect on why is it that folks feel such a strong need to control other people's access to this information, and that kind of power dynamic, especially when we're talking about children's books or young adult books or things that are hard to seek out. I think that is a really important question about understanding like how power is distributed in our society. And that's why we have to read banned books to challenge that dynamic.
Wonderfully said. Yep. Absolutely. Our history is told by oftentimes who's writing the narrative, right? So it's important that people have as much access to that as possible. Well, panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. As we wrap up today's session, we do have our banned books resource guide, which, Sveta, if it's okay, I'm actually going to ask you to talk about it as a resource from the library.
Yeah, definitely. So our banned books resource guide, check it out. It's got some interesting stats and data from the American Library Association about the sort of censorship by the numbers from the past year. It's also got some information about the events that we're holding this week to celebrate, including this panel. And we've also pulled a selection of titles that are on the ALA's frequently banned books with diverse content list that we have at the library. So if you want to pick up one of those titles, they're divided by genre and you can request them from the catalog. If you're looking for a study break, I would send you there to start.
Wonderful. Well, again, panelists, thank you so much for joining. Stay safe. To our viewers, thanks for joining in, and be sure to check out the rest of the events happening as part of Banned Books. And go read. Go read, everybody. Go read and then go vote. I like to take this as an opportunity. I always remind people, get registered to vote. You can go to TurboVote or DePaul.turbovote.org. Obviously, we've got a pretty important election coming up, so I always like to make that plug whenever we've got people around too. So read, and then go vote, or read while you're waiting in line to vote. Just read, just vote. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Sounds like a good plan. Thanks for having us.